Dobro jutro. Prebacit ćemo se na engleski, pošto su govornici engleski, ali prije toga dobrodošli na drugi dan konferencije. Pa hvala vam što ste došli u ovo rano jutro. Idemo krenuti. Let me introduce Hans de Rad and Robin Edgar with their presentation, Open Source XOR Money. Here you go.
Thank you. Before we start, I'd like to check if you in the back can hear me. Yeah, we have a little bit of a different setup in audio, so my volume is a bit lower than his, but is that okay back there? Yeah, you can hear it fine? Smile and nod, please. Yeah, yes. Thumbs right. Up all the way at the back. All right, excellent, thank you. Awesome. Okay, well, good morning. Good morning. Welcome to our talk, and thank you for coming. We're going to be talking about open source, business, ideology, all kinds of things that we feel are quite important in the community but are not being talked about enough. Yeah, and to bring it, I think I have feedback to the sound guy upstairs, but to first raise a bit of a warning, this may not be a very pleasant message for some. It is, however, a very urgent message that we feel needs addressing, because currently, and we'll elaborate on that later, we see a lot of projects, in our opinion, who could do a lot better if a couple of business circumstances are being at least addressed and approached properly. So, but first of all, and this is especially for the people sitting up here and up there and running around everywhere in the conference, thank you, guys and girls, for inviting us again. Yeah. Even after our performance last year, you still wanted us to come. So, and you're pulling off a great conference again. So thank you, and I think they deserve a round of applause. So. Yeah. To the volunteers and the people who actually run this, it's absolutely fantastic. It's run really well again. We're enjoying ourselves so far. And, well, as it says, in lots of languages. So enough of the smooth talking, here we go. Hi, well, I'm Robin Edgar. I'd like to give you a very quick introduction. I spent about 14 years running a web-based software company. We built everything in PHP on a LAMP stack. Last year I was here, I was talking about multipath routing. So from that you can kind of get the idea that I do some business, but I also do technical. I think it's just a lot of fun. And all of my business in the last couple of years has been based on open source software. So open source is incredibly important. At the moment, I'm doing consultancy, business strategy, and learning how to fly like airplanes. So yeah, I'm Hans de Rad. I've been here. This is, I think, my third time here at this conference, which is awesome. I love recurring events like this. I have a company in the Netherlands called Open Innovations. It's more or less a company around me and my personal interests around open source technical stuff, security, teaching, and I work with a number of other companies like Robin's to fulfill specific niche markets. Currently I'm very active in healthcare. Healthcare is a sector that's incredibly dependent on compliancy regulations. If you take medical research projects which can span multiple years or even decades, you can understand that the circumstances and especially the systems deployed within those research projects must be controlled very well to ensure that a coherent set of results is produced over time. That's an area that I specialize in, but open source software is something that I've simply always worked with. I mean, it was for me the go-to model in the middle of the 90s, because basically everything else either didn't work or didn't feel right.
Or we were young and couldn't afford it.
Yeah, that's another thing.
That's another thing.
Yeah. So that brings us to the next slide. What's our personal interest in this? And basically, I have a motto, which is I do whatever I like, as long as I don't go bankrupt with it. Which you could also turn around, like I would like to have a sustainable business model for everything I would like to do. That doesn't necessarily have to make me rich, but it does have to provide me with a certain basic level of comfort and a basic quality of life.
Yeah, it's fun to do fun things, but it's also important that you can do the fun things that you want to do. And that's one of the key things that money does for you, is it enables you to make more choices in your life. So we're not really interested in being hugely rich. I mean, we didn't fly in on a private jet, and we don't drive Aston Martins. But we do think it's very important that you have a basic level of income.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've noticed over the past couple of years, I've been giving talks about open source and making money with computer systems, security, freelancing. I've also given a workshop, I think, here, do's and don'ts of freelancing, on how you can collaborate with multiple freelancers in a corporation and everything. But I've ended up with this, yeah, a bit of an unsatisfied feeling of something missing in that model. Because basically all I was talking about was how to make money around a certain model and not with a certain model. And that model is open source software. So what we've done for this talk is that we're going to approach this in a threefold manner. We're going to establish that there is a problem, and we will explain why there is a problem and how this problem came into existence and who are the primary casualties of this problem, if you will. And then we will suggest a number of ways or solutions or parts of solutions to see how we can cope with that problem. And
in the process, we'll kick some shins. We'll make some people unhappy, unfortunately, and we'll also talk some generalization about a very wide and diverse group, which we know that that isn't homogeneous. It's all the same people, but we feel that a large amount of people in this group have this problem. So, you know, we know that there's some people all the way very, very ideological about open source, and there's some people much less and more pragmatic about it. We are talking to all of you, though. But let's start off with, yeah.
Let's be very, very clear about this. We don't claim to have the end-all solution. We don't even know if you here perceive the same problem as we do. But we would like to take you into this journey with us to try and establish a certain level of bare necessities and then go from there.
Yeah, and some of the slides will have lots and lots of text on them because it's a quite complex problem. We're going to not read the texts, we're going to talk around them because we assume that you guys know how to read. So sorry, we want to apologize for that beforehand because yeah, you're going to have to read and listen, and multitasking not always easy.
But the slides, of course, will be available afterwards. And one more thing, if you have questions or anything, we will try to save some time at the end of the presentation to discuss with you, because we actually want to actively discuss with you. And during the presentation, we will ask your input on a number of occasions. But please, if you would be so kind to not ask questions all the way through, because that would disrupt the
flow of the...
but there will be much room for interaction, because, like I said, this is an interactive approach, and we want your input. We want to validate.
We want to start a discussion, and we want to know what you guys think.
So, the problem that we see is that, at least from our point of view, there's an increasing number of projects in the open source realm that is struggling in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, lots of them are falling apart. Lots of them are getting into fights, and you see that the community tightness that you associate with the open source community isn't quite there anymore.
And this is not only about open source projects for the software components, but you also see this on a community level. You see conference organizers having trouble getting the funds ready to organize conferences, and you also see a lack of, I would say, professionality in the approach of building up communities and maintaining communities. And professionality might be a bit of a harsh word. You might see this as continuity. And one of the core issues here being that as most of these organizations are volunteer-driven, it's really hard to create a sustainable environment with volunteers alone.
Yeah, and you're also seeing that communities now, where a product was fairly simple, it was fairly small, and well, a product, or just a project is a probably better word, some of them are becoming absolute monsters, which take much more professionality to be able to continue to develop in a successful and meaningful way. So if you, for example, take the Apache project, yeah, you know, no one guy is going to sit and do all of that. If you look at a database like MySQL, NoSQL, MariaDB, etc., you know, that's too big for just one person to do. And that can lead to trouble if you're working with people who just say, I have a fun idea, let's go do it, and then suddenly other people start adding to it.
Yeah, a clear example of this in recent years, and I think something that's a very dangerous development for at least our online security and privacy, was the problem that the PGP developer Werner Koch had a couple of years ago. Basically, PGP, let me just first ask, who here doesn't know PGP? So everybody uses encrypted email with PGP, awesome. But basically, this was a single person operation. I'm going on a limb a bit, but the entire privacy of the email communication on the internet relied on one person. And that one person was almost not paid for his work, went into social support, etc., etc., etc. So what he did was he raised a crowdfunding campaign, but then two very interesting things happened. First of all, he got, well, a decent sum of money from the crowdfunding campaign, so that he could at least develop PGP for a couple of years more. But what happened as well was that he was being attacked by a large group in the open source / hacker community for even wanting to have money in the first place. And that kind of blew my mind. I mean, because this guy was doing a fundamental aspect of our online security, asked for at least a little bit of a reward, and then got a little bit of a reward, but then, oh, I'm going too fast here, but then was scrutinized for actually wanting something that would keep him alive. So that's another thing that we see, because open source is very much about people. But people are human beings. They have emotions. They are driven by a cycle of reward, recognition, etc., etc. Maybe you, as a psychologist, can catch up with this a little bit more.
No, it's we're seeing behavior which is just basically unacceptable. We see people on mailing lists within communities feeling free to insult everybody. We see people deciding that, you know, it's fine for people to go out and go nuts and form a little group and then try and diss what other people are saying. I mean, you know, we get the examples with Linus all the time, you know, that he goes out and says some strongly worded stuff. But to be honest, I've been on community lists where people have really, they've started swearing at each other in a much, much more powerful way than Linus ever does. Which, you know, leads to people going, yeah, well, why am I doing this? And they drop out. People get upset. They find that they're running basically running a project on their own, and there's a lot of stuff to do in a project. Yeah. So, you know, if you look at a typical project, you'll get bug reports, and you'll have to sift through the bug reports and decide which ones you're going to fix and which ones you're not going to. You know that some of the people who are inserting bug reports, they're going to keep mailing you until you fix it, and other people have something which is easy to fix, but you know, you're never going to get round to it because there's just other priorities. And then at the same time, you have people asking for feature requests and then getting upset at you for not implementing the feature requests. And actually, you're trying to do this while you're holding a job or a study. So you really have to prioritize time. And that's very difficult. That can lead to people basically burning out. And you see this happening in projects all over the place, unfortunately. Sabre Dav recently, the guy just said, I quit. I've had enough.
Who of you uses OwnCloud, Nextcloud, Pydio? Who of you uses that?
Yeah, you
I
do
would
know
expect
this.
more people, but not knowing about it. But do you realize that the core maintainer of one of the core elements of those software pieces simply said, well, I can't do this anymore because nobody's helping me out. And that's the thing also we'll talk about later, the recognition. I mean, you are probably aware of the names of the file sharing systems that we just mentioned. But were you aware that there was a project underneath them called Sabre Dav, which basically powered them all? Probably not. Same thing. Who here has an Android phone?
Have you guys ever looked at the little info screen where it says which other open source projects are used inside it? It's quite a lot, but no one knows. You know, so even in terms of recognition, you can get attribution in Android, and no one will know.
And that's also a problem because open source software is creating an immense amount of value. There are companies making billions and billions of dollars and euros with open source, which is perfectly fine. I mean, let's make this very clear. We have no objection to companies making money at all. But what is a problem is that underneath the product propositions of these companies are all these, well, lone developers sitting there making no money and getting no recognition for that. And that is a problem, because we are human beings. We need to be cuddled every once in a while.
Yeah, whatever your motivation is, you know, it's at least one of those things. You want the world to know you're doing something cool. And it's nice to have that known within a small community, but if you see your project ballooning up, then you go, yeah, you know, and if you've been working on the same project again and again and again, then yeah, you know, why are you really doing it then?
And the thing is that we've been talking about business for the last 10 minutes or so, and that's, well, we also go to quite a lot of conferences, and I was at OpenSUSE conference last week. I've been to dozens of conferences before, but the 10 minutes that we've been talking about business right now is probably more than in most of the other conferences in the past months combined. So
let's talk about something else.
Yeah, no. We've got an hour to talk about business.
Oh, okay.
So you will hear about business for an hour. The thing is, and this is not necessarily an accusation or anything, it's just it's just something that we've noticed, is that open source in general has never been about business. It has no roots in business environments. It has no, its origins came from, let's say, the 1970s, when people noticed that large companies were producing software over which they didn't have control, which they didn't like, and then they started to write their own software and started to exchange that software between one another. And then in the 1980s and especially the 1990s, we started to formalize those interactions and those exchanges by forming the GPL and some other licenses, of which we have plenty nowadays. But the thing is, that's the origin of open source. Another origin of open source that you see is that it's actually a byproduct of other top-level business products. If you look at Facebook and Google and Apple and, well, you can go on forever,
yeah,
they are all creating an enormous amount of open source software, but not on their primary product.
We see that now a lot with artificial intelligence software. I don't know if you guys are busy with deep learning at all, But in the past couple of months, loads of these platforms have been open source. So you have the Open AI system by NVIDIA, you have Microsoft Graph Engine, you have TensorFlow by Google. What else did I write down? Yeah, you know, Amazon, Infosys, Yahoo, even Elon Musk, they're all open sourcing these systems. Why? Not because they're ideologically going, yeah, you know, we think open source is the way to go. No, because they're in the beginnings. They're receiving X amount of funding. They want everyone to use this product. They want everyone to use it, and they want you to help them build it into a better system. So it's a very self-centered ideology that these companies are bringing.
Yeah, and the basic distinction that we would like to identify here first is the last one, is that most of the open source software that has been written and is being released so far from either academic origins or big companies is being produced by people who have their basic necessities supported by having a normal income. And so researchers or
academics,
Google employees or academics, they simply have a paycheck every month. So for them, open source is simply something that's, well, yeah, sure, I can release this as open source because I'm not dependent on making money with my project for my daily bread.
It's easy, and as long as the institution they work for agree with it, because they're either in the academic world not going to make a lot of money from it, or that's not the intention, or they're going to make money from it, but they feel that, well, you know, if I open source part of my project or a little bit, and then I'll get some valuable input, that'll add value to the project.
Yeah, but nowadays what we also see is that we have a huge ecosystems of companies around open source software and trying to survive by implementing open source, by supporting open source, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We'll go into that later.
Yeah.
Because what we see is that, as described here, open source is either a byproduct, often, or it comes from a direct necessity in either an academic environment or other.
So while we're talking about ideology, I would like to ask, because I've met some people very die-hard open source, you know, it has to be that way, can't be else, it can't be anything else other than open source. Who here owns an Apple or an iPhone? Yeah. How ideological is that? Who uses Gmail? Yeah, look at that.
I mean, this is not an accusation, this is not bad, but I mean, there is a contradiction between firmly believing in open source ideology and using, well, basically a platform that sells your soul to the advertisement industry.
We just thought we'd point that out a little bit before we really start to say weird stuff.
And we're very much about subtle in this approach, as you may have noticed, we're Dutch.
Yeah.
So there's a problem. Because, well, how do you actually sell or buy something that by nature is not even considered to be something that you could sell or
maybe even a product.
Or indeed even a product, maybe it's just a byproduct of something that happens to other people and you see and you think, like, hey, I can reuse this. So,
who owns it? Sometimes it's very clear, you know, you have certain companies that build a certain product. So for example, in Roundcube, you know, there's only one developer. Do you know that? There's one developer making all of Roundcube.
That's not entirely true, but there's one lead
but he's the basic developer, and yeah, he's been doing this for 6 years. So it's quite easy to say, if I wanted to buy Roundcube and I just needed to put wads of money into someone's hand, that's easy. But if you look at the larger projects, you know, who really owns them?
But the problem in this is primarily that if you look at places where you could make money, then the enterprise market is basically, well, that's where the money is. Whether that's in healthcare, whether that's in finance, whether that's in consulting or any other evil marketplace. But the thing is with enterprise that you simply need to go through proper procurement processes to get your products somewhere in their infrastructure. And there's a number of reasons for that, because they also have to adhere to compliance regulations. We'll go into that later. But they also want to be in control. They want to know what they're using, and they also want to know who they're going to call when something goes wrong.
Yeah, it's about risk management. They want to know that a product has been properly tested, that if something goes wrong and they do, for example, need to do an edit on it, they can call someone who can actually read through the spaghetti that is the code and hope it isn't spaghetti.
And then there's also the last point is, because it's hard for a non-legal entity to be making money through enterprise means, that means also that the non-legal entity will have little money to spend on like marketing, promotion, like basically all those pesky business aspects like Microsoft spends billions a year on.
Yeah.
And that's another problem. From the compliance point of view, we're pretty much in a situation where I would say from a legal point of view, and I'm absolutely not a lawyer, but we've spoken also at FOSS this year to a number of lawyers who specialized in open source enforcement models. And I would describe the current situation as quicksand. There's a big problem, because how can you actually identify the person enforcing the open source license on a certain library? How can you link that person to the actual open source community around that product or library? Because open source is a very open and fast-moving and changing ecosystem of different people. You will see that, and we've named a couple, you will see people outside of a community project certainly starting to enforce the GPL for that project without even consulting with the original author of the open source project. So if that sounds a bit strange, well, that feels strange. The most notable point is what Thomas McHardy was doing a couple of years ago. Linux kernel developer for the NetFilter module. McHardy decided to sue a couple of companies in Germany, most notably, I think, because of their alleged GPL violations. And what he wanted was financial compensation for those violations. But how does that work? He was not the original author of the work he was trying to defend. He was asking financial compensation to companies which were probably not even aware that they were violating anything, but all right. But then what? If he would have been granted this financial compensation, where would that go? That would go to him personally. And, well, he has given very little indication of what he would have done with this money. Well, all his lawsuits for now have been dismissed. And that's also the case with a number of other, like Helvig versus VMware, which was about linking stuff to the kernel. It's very hard to find actual, tangible, and coherent precedent regarding the enforceability of open source models. We recently had one that comes a bit close. That was Hancom versus the author of GhostScript, where Hancom, being a Korean company that incorporated the GhostScript library in their Office.
If any of you has a Samsung phone, you'll have Hancom Office.
Yeah, and what they didn't do was simply GPL license the code. So a federal judge in the US, for now, has ruled that Hancom should construct a dual licensing deal with the author of GhostScript. And this I find also interesting, but because dual licensing, where does that leave open source? Where does that leave the GPL? And actually, the GPL, or the FSF explanation of the GPL, pretty much encourages companies towards the dual licensing model when wanting to make money/commercial stuff. So there's a very clear distinction, but this distinction feels artificial. So we'll go on for that. In general, there's some basic laws of economy, but first we wanted to go And a bit of a different route.
I'll tell you a little story about a friend of mine who worked for a battery and solar panel generator. And actually, the batteries were better than the solar panels. You know, these modular things, and energy storage is a thing at the moment. But the solar panels, they're basically having their ass kicked by an Israeli company, which is much cheaper, less good technology, etc. But he had awesome batteries, and he said, well, I can't sell the batteries because we've got this failing solar department. How can I improve the sales of these batteries? They're awesome. You just plug them in, and you get statistics, and God knows what. You know, you can change it a lot. You can monitor. You can see exactly which solar panel is failing, etc. So I said, well, why don't you open source it? You know, you've got really nothing to lose. And he's like, well, what are the arguments for open source? So it came with, like, you have a big customer footprint. If you open source the APIs, you'll see that techies, they'll think this is awesome, and they'll start building interfaces on top of yours. They'll start using the figures and the information, the data, for things you haven't even thought of. And you'll find that you have not only a large user base, but you'll also have interesting features. And he said, all right, so, you know, can you give me some examples of successful open source companies where, you know, this model has been used, and, you know, big companies. So I called up Hans, and I said, so can you? Come on, give us some examples of really financially successful open source companies. Anyone?
Please?
Absolutely. Red Hat, yeah, that's one.
Let's park that one. Name 5 more.
Yeah, come on. Open source, come on, guys.
SUSE, indeed. We'll come on to Red Hat and SUSE later, indeed.
Ubuntu.
Might be.
But we don't really actually know how much money they're making because their finances are closed. I think that Mark Shuttleworth is pumping money into that company.
Is that actually already break-even? I don't think so.
Yeah.
And actually, Monty recently did this interesting suggestion for a business open source license, which we'll go into later.
Yeah.
But indeed, Red Hat and SUSE are 2 examples. Come on. OpenVRT.
The routing thing, yeah. Not making much money.
No, I mean, they're like surviving, but it's not. There's a difference between surviving and being alive.
Well, at least you guys, sorry? IBM, is it open source? Partly. Yeah, partly.
Well, they're mostly consulting and selling licenses.
Yeah, I think that's where most of their money comes out of. They're adding value around their open source propositions.
But I find IBM an interesting company because what IBM does really well is adopt new business models and strategy over time. And they're looking very actively at making an open source business model work, also with the Open Power Foundation. We'll go into that later as well.
But saying IBM is actually a bit like saying Microsoft, which has also got a lot of open source software.
Yeah.
But we all know it's not an open source company.
but you may notice a trend in the current responsiveness in this discussion, because there's a couple of examples, and the examples which are successful are pretty big. Yeah. And there's also a couple of examples being given, which are relatively small, but I have absolutely no idea of any SME in primarily open source actually being over that survival mode. And I want them to be, because I think they deserve to be financially sustainable. But what I see a lot with a lot of open source, purely open source companies, is they're mostly cash flow driven. Money comes in, money goes out. Very little actual buffer is taking place, and that's what worrying me.
Yeah, because there's loads and loads of, fantastic. If you look at some of the install bases of some of the software we have, like for example Roundcube we mentioned earlier, but Debian.
They deserve to be filthy rich.
Millions and millions of install bases. How come they're not rich?
Well, let's go to a bit of the basic economic laws. And to make another disclaimer, you don't have to be happy with these. You don't have to believe in that this is the right model for society to work, because personally I think there's a lot of issues with this model, because basically it's all about withholding something and making money by withholding. But it is the dominant way how at least half of the world's economy works. And we may as well try to pick up a couple of pieces from it, because like it or not, we are part of those economies. We operate in that economic ecosystem. We cannot shut our eyes and pretend the world isn't happening. No, this is what it is. So we have to make a couple of moves in that direction. Basically, I've made an agile user story of how economy works. Read it up later.
Yeah.
And
if you've done economics, you recognize some of the Keynesian, supply, demand, scarcity, etc. And people in the open source sector basically say, yeah, that doesn't really apply to us.
no, it doesn't, because we're giving away the core product, which is fine.
So, yeah, no, it doesn't.
But there's a couple of notable exceptions in which we, as a society, have said, well, this whole scarcity-based model is all fine and well, but we need to take care of a couple of points because they're really important. And then you come into the realm of like critical infrastructure. And critical infrastructure nowadays also includes telcos, ISPs, internet, energy, etc.
It's roads, energy.
What I find very interesting about the critical infrastructure policies of multiple countries, and I've tried to read through most of the European ones, I was actually paid to do that. But you see that they focus on hardware, pretty much on hardware. And they take the software part pretty much for granted, which is interesting. There's a clear distinction in that.
Yeah, you can...
But to go on, because we're going a bit too slow.
Oh, okay.
And we want to have the discussion.
Yeah.
One of the biggest problems, and we already touched this a little bit, is the fact that we have invisible heroes in open source. Open source is, for most products, a very well-kept secret, especially to the end user. The end user of an Android phone, I mean, you are the technical crowd. And I will guess that none of you, like we just asked, had ever looked at the info screen looking at all the underlying libraries.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't, then who the hell is?
Yeah.
And don't you think that those guys building all those libraries, and girls, by the way, we need more women in software in general, and especially also in open source, don't you think that they deserve the recognition and the attention? And this is also the problem when currently selling open source to enterprise. It's almost always part of a bigger product. So basically the whole open source aspect of it stays hidden for the enterprise. And
which means for an enterprise, why would you contribute?
Exactly.
Because it's magically there, you don't even know it's there. You know, as a maybe interested user, why would you join a project if you don't know it's there, or you don't realize that there is this whole underlying layer which is the foundation of everything they use? People don't know, it's like, I think most people think that web servers still run on Windows. I don't think they realize that everything runs Linux, and they definitely don't know that Apache powers most of them, and that maybe NGINX is now coming up. They don't care. They can't see it.
But the problem especially is that for the open source developer and contributor, you're basically on the level as which the musicians and artists are in our society. Namely, somehow people expect these people to simply accept exposure as being a reward.
So how many of you guys have ever had a friend or someone who's heard that you're a programmer come up to you and say, well, I have a great business plan. If you make it, I'll sell it. And then you say, well, all right, it's going to cost X amount of thousand to build. And they say, no, you get a share in the company. Have you guys ever heard this? Yeah, I can see some nodding back there.
So, what this is going to, and this is something that we as Dutch are very sensible for, we see this going to a certain perfect storm scenario. Let's go into history a little bit. Before the 1950s in the Netherlands, basically the maintenance of dikes and water protection barriers, and as most of you know, most of the Netherlands is actually below sea level, so dikes are a bit of a thing. That was done through small community management. You had all these individual and organizations very much tied to local municipalities maintaining their little bit of the water protection infrastructure. They were improving it, they were doing the best they could.
Does this sound familiar to people in open source projects?
So
That
yes,
if you're in a big project, you have a little community doing a little part of it, or it's a little project which is incorporated next to many other projects, and it's a little community doing their thing and another. So.
But then something happened, because in the 1930s and the 1940s, especially in the south of the Netherlands, there were some islands with very fertile ground, and a lot of farmers moved there to deploy economic endeavors there. They were simply creating value. However, as the usage of the land and the value proposition of the land increased, the model of community protection maintenance wasn't altered. And that changed in 1953, because what happened then, it was a combination of several elements. It was a multi-day storm, about a week-long northwestern storm, I think, which was banging water on the coast, which was actually building up water in front of the islands. And that was combined then with something called a spring flood, which basically means that every once in a while you have an irregularly high flood in your
Okay,
in
but
your
basically
environment.
it's the projects are becoming bigger, and more people are, the projects are becoming more important that you guys are involved on,
Exactly.
and they're becoming more vulnerable.
And then one of the dikes broke. And that was a bit of a problem, because when one of the dikes broke, basically the whole chain failed, which caused thousands and thousands of deaths, ruined fertile farming land. The Netherlands had to relocate thousands of farmers to another part of the country to be able to keep up with food production. And that's the perfect storm scenario. The perfect storm scenario basically means that a number of individual aspects coming together, and the individual aspects by themselves are not as disruptive, but combined, they simply create catastrophe. And that's what we also see with, how many of you have followed the re-implementation or evolvement of like Perl 5 to 6, or PHP 5 to 7, or Drupal 7 to 8, or, I mean, there's a big issue in the current open source model, which basically allows for small incremental developments and updates, but major overhauls, well, we simply don't have the capacity. We simply don't have the financial buffer to invest that much money and time to actually do a proper overhaul, and that's technical debt. And that's the perfect storm scenario, because that's actually adding up, and we need to get out of there.
And we're seeing it in more and more products, It's not just the people who thought about writing things in Ruby and then now decided I'd rather do it in Rust. It's, people writing stuff in PHP 4 and going, well, it's time to do something about that,
Yeah. So another thing, compliance. We've already talked about it a little bit, but there's a reason why companies buy and implement software and services the way they do. Because it's not only about them not wanting to do something else, it's also by a lot of companies not being allowed to just go out in the woods, pick up some mushrooms and cook a nice recipe with it. No, they need an actual supplier who went through proper due diligence, who is being held accountable for the support.
Has a proper quality assurance.
And they are not, that's not something that they come up with themselves. No, that's something that they are obliged to do that by law. I spoke about the healthcare industry earlier. We recently had the outbreak of the, what was it,
We've had loads of them.
The ransomware
the WannaCry thing.
Yeah, WannaCry, exactly. And what we noticed about that, especially a lot of healthcare institutions were hit by that because they were running old software. Well, let me assure you, they are not running old software because they're incompetent idiots. No, they're running old software because they have to maintain a certain validated state in their IT infrastructure, because if they don't, well, they can simply throw away decades of research work, because they can't reproduce certain results. And that's a big problem for them. That's a big problem which actually is being mitigated at the moment by forcing the suppliers, the IT suppliers, in healthcare contracts to come up with a normal upgrade path and implement open standards and et cetera, et cetera. That's something that I'm actively involved with.
And it's not the most interesting programming to do, and it's not the most interesting way of working, but if you want uptake by big companies, compliance is an absolute necessity.
And currently the as-is or best effort or do-it-yourself model of open source kind of like doesn't exactly compute. So enough of the problem. Let's try to see what the companies currently are already doing to go around this problem and create a financially sustainable ecosystem. Because that's what it's all about. I mean, it's not, we don't want to cry wolf. We don't want to create a feeling that we're all doomed or anything. We're not. I mean, we can do something about this. We can actually pick this up and make it work a lot better.
Yeah, so let's have a look at what are open source companies typically doing now. I go to FOSDEM and I see quite a lot of this, and you know, it's just to me incredible that Firefox occasionally puts up a thing saying, if everyone donates $3, then we'll be rich and we'll be able to continue to code. And you're going, the install base of Firefox is massive.
So what's the message that a project is sending then? I mean, especially to enterprise. If you were
You can't trust me because I might not be around next year.
That is the exact message.
That's, you know, it's just, it's embarrassing, to be honest. You know, every time I see that thing, I have donated to these guys, and I just feel really bad. Crippleware is another thing, guys.
Yeah, or freemium or other
yeah,
kinds of
there's loads of different ways of looking at this, and that's not really what we call open source anymore. One which does look quite interesting, and which everyone says that's kind of the way to do it, is BIOS for support or implementation. But the problem is that a lot of the people who look at open source products, they can do the support, they can do the implementation. So I don't think many people have called Zend or no, the PHP company for their implementation of a project. They call guys like me. You know, I'm in the neighborhood, I'm right next door. So I'm giving them the support. I'm giving them the...
and the trouble with that model is that being a freelancer, of course, you only have so much time to specialize in a certain aspect of the architecture. So that's what you're good at. But you need the backup of other guys, girls, like us for the other projects. So it's very important to establish a network to be able to provide full-scale support. But that's a model that actually works. I mean, consultancy and...
for freelance, at a freelance level it works, and also at... but yeah, the problem is that it works for the freelancer more than the developer.
And it has a scalability problem as well, because, I mean, you can only do so much work, and then you have to hire people, and you can only hire so much people, and then, etc.
Yeah. And the worst of the lot is of course, selling swag.
Well, we also have the hit-and-run type of thing, at least that's what I call it, crowdfunding campaigns. I've helped out with a number of crowdfunding campaigns, not only in software, but also in music and culture. But the problem with crowdfunding is usually that, I would say it's a hit-and-run type of donation. It's basically what you would do to ease your conscience. Like, okay, this project is developing something new. I've been using this for years, so I now will help them to make this one bit full stop. How does that work? Because that bit that has been developed must also be maintained, must also be improved, must also be, etc., etc., etc. So doing crowdfunding for projects is fine up until a certain level, but it also increases the technical depth of a project, which also needs support. So, and yeah, selling swag. I mean, that's basically like sitting out in the street with your head in front of you.
Please.
Please, sir,
you know,
give me
come
some
on,
more.
guys. We can't do that.
And that's a bit of a problem. So how... And oh yeah, we come back to this scarcity thingy. Because we have projects in abundance, and, well, we have students and developers like you also, quite many of them. But there is a limit to what you can do. So if you would argue that the normal economic model of scarcity doesn't apply on open source, well, it does. It only does it from a different perspective. You have a limited number of developers. You have a limited number of availability or possibilities to host your code, because that also takes money and effort, and etc.
Yeah.
And then there's...
Well, yeah, exactly. We have ideology. You know, why do people do this? Why do people go for an open source model? Basically, there's many reasons, you know. Unfortunately, we do see that money influences the way you have to behave.
And money also influences open source. I mean, the System D development was primarily sponsored by Red Hat at first. And why was Red Hat able to do that? Well, basically because they have the money. So in the ideological idea that open source and money have no relation with each other, well, no, it's not true. Of course you're being influenced by money. Mark Shuttleworth is pumping millions into Ubuntu, into Unity, etc.
And so he gets to make a lot of choices on what happens in the Linux front.
So there's another business model.
Yeah, well, now we're having a look at what the really big guys like Facebook do, and Google. It's called data harvesting. You're the product. Isn't that great? And all what these guys are doing is they're basically trying to get you to visit their page. They want you to spend as much time as possible on their site so that they can sell you more advertising. And they use all kinds of different tricks to do this, like auto-playing videos or just putting up little announcements or sending you notifications saying, you've got something interesting, come visit me. Yeah. And then once you're on there, come stay with me. And then once you're there, you're giving away your personal habits. They're processing this and they're selling that to advertisers to make money off you.
So to cut it a bit short, how is this applicable in open source? Yeah, not.
Well, so, yeah, we could do this, but we really feel that this is not the way forwards for open source. So no.
But it is a very important business model.
we do want to highlight it as a business model.
And there's some more. I mean, you can always create specific custom code for customers around an open source project. That's basically what happens a lot in the CMS ecosystem, and Drupal and Acquia are just one example, but WordPress and a lot of companies do the same. And they create plugins or custom software for customers, license that in a different way, so that if the customer wants to change vendor, how are they going to do that?
Yeah, so, you know, we don't really feel that that's a viable business model either. You know, just creating a basic product and then saying, well, we'll sell stuff around it so that actually we are the only people you can go to. That's also very counter the ethos of open source, we feel.
Yeah, so we had a couple of not acceptable business models, right? So let's look at a bit more acceptable business models.
So here you have what happens at SUSE and Red Hat. They certify you, which, you know, we've just had this whole story about compliance and what businesses need. This is what they need, and that's why these guys are so successful.
Yeah, and they sell you a tested and very well-documented version of their open source product.
They have a very good support system, which you know you can reach, you know who you can reach, you know how you can reach them. They have account managers, they have contract managers, and everything that they basically need.
They make open source business compatible.
Yeah.
So number 2 is a governance model, a foundation, and then
basically they say everyone can have a bit of money. We will sell out a little bit, and then you can have a talk about it. But yeah, you know, you're seeing that all the projects that go there seem to kind of simmer down and die a little bit.
But that's more of lately. But then you have another type of thing. And to go back to the flooding disaster in the Netherlands, one of the things that you have to realize that as a society, there are a number of models which we find actually, apparently, acceptable to raise tax on. And taxes don't necessarily have to be nation-state-like taxes or federal taxes. Think about local taxes. Think about, in the Netherlands, like we said, the water management ecosystem. That's actually a 1,200-year-old democratic system based on a local management level, raises its own taxes, is entirely autonomous, and it actually works very well. Also, there's a number of other things, but basically what we've decided upon as society is that we can impose tax and...
So outside of a software system, this is considered to be a way of distributing the load upon the people who really need to build stuff that is the base level of our society.
Yeah, but bear in mind that taxes don't necessarily correspond to government or whatnot. So...
Okay, lots of serious stuff.
What do we propose?
Okay, well, we're running out of time a bit, I think, so
yeah,
we're going to have to go pretty quickly through this. This is where we start looking at things that maybe people will find a bit controversial. My solution is something called FOSS M, and the M stands for mostly. At the moment, one of there's two points in the definition of open source which really stop us from making money through open source. We say in one of the points, yeah, you're allowed to repackage it and make money through the repackaging, but you're not allowed to discriminate against persons or groups. So that means that you can't say a company is different from a person, which, you know, to my mind is actually nonsense. Within companies, there's different types of companies. You have for-profit, not-for-profit, foundations, etc. We do discriminate, and we give them different tax rights. And then you say, well, you know, you're not allowed to say, if you're an academic institution, then we'll treat you differently from a Fortune 500 institution.
And this is also something that in our society is quite common to actually discriminate upon. We have a concept called public benefit organizations, like educational, cultural, healthcare, and such, and they get all kinds of tax benefits and
they're treated differently. So anyway, what I say is this comes forth from a long tradition of people sitting together and being paid to create software, which they can incidentally open source. That's lovely. And then we got all these little rules around them, like we have to not discriminate, we have to, licenses, etc. All this cruft got added. But let's be clear, open source to me, free open source to me means the source code. It's about the source code, right? So I'm saying as long as you distribute the source code and you and you allow people to audit it, check it, change it maybe, then it is still open source. So I'm saying we should start making a distinction business-wise. We should say it's free for you to install, to use, etc. But if you start using it 1,000 users for 1,000 users or 1,000 clients, or maybe 100, or maybe 12,000, whatever number is set, then we start charging you. And because it's ridiculous that you're making such a huge amount of money off my software where I'm not seeing anything.
Yeah. I sympathize with Robin's idea, but this is about where we don't agree. Because I don't see that model being very scalable, but we'll go into a bit of a very spontaneous discussion later. What I would like to go into is inter-community distributed accreditation and more or less micro-taxations by using perhaps something of the blockchain. So without taking too much time, let's go. Oh yeah, and the big disclaimer again, these are not the end-all solutions at all.
Yeah, we're looking for input. We don't think we found the Holy Grail. No, and you can already tell because we have two totally different approaches.
And we want to start a discussion because we really believe that it's a problem that needs addressing. So
yeah, here's the question and answer bit. Yeah.
we've had so many discussions with ourselves already about these topics that we simply decided to map something out. But feel free to add. Yeah. This is the part for audience interaction. You can, as long as you don't throw stuff at us, we're happy with it.
Yeah, what the questions come down to is basically, yeah, it should be completely free. I think I just talked about that a bit. Yeah, well, it is completely free as long as we're talking about the source. DRM, enforcement, yeah, it's difficult. You don't know exactly who's installed it and how many times they've installed it. You can't really find out. But that's where this ghost script HANCOM thing comes in. You know, it can be enforced if you do find out. It is possible. So yeah, there's a kind of an honesty system going on there, but there's definitely legal recourse, at least in America, which is now has legal precedent. to allow you to really say, I want my money. So it is enforceable. Is it perfect? I don't know. But if you get 25% of the people admitting that they've installed large amounts of your software, then 25% revenue is better than nothing at all, which is what most people right now are getting.
Yeah, let me hook into this. What I personally, I don't agree with this model for various reasons, but what I find interesting and positive and necessary is that the effort to actually create an enforcement type of activity also increases the awareness of especially companies in the fact that they're using open source and that they should be starting to think about how they're going to handle it. If you write to a company a formal letter saying, hey, your license, of course this requires an adaptation of a number of licenses, but hey, your license is stating this, you're not compliant, well then usually companies start to think, because most companies want to be compliant, most companies want to do this honestly. Again, like I said, I'm not fully supporting this model, neither is Robin my model, but I want to elaborate on my model and then we go into discussion because we are really running out of time.
We gotta go.
To add to the very spontaneous discussion, what I'm proposing more or less is an ecosystem where open source communities help each other in enforcing the distribution of, let's say, certified versions of their product. And how can they do this enforcement? Because the problem with enforcement usually also means is you have to create a large body to pick up the enforcement or do governing, like we all love ICANN for handling the top-level domain of the internet. But nowadays we have a very interesting technology like the blockchain. Bitcoin, for instance, is all around the concept that small entities mutually confirm each other's transactions, and by that simply create an almost unbreakable inventory of items. So if you are an open source community project and you release something like a container which contains your version of deployed source code, be that tested, documented, etc., etc. If that container is then being used in combination with other containers or other distributables, those should be able to check in the central inventory if a party involved is actually allowed to run it. And then, through the same Bitcoin-like technology, you could enable a system of micropayments over the whole ecosystem to reward a developer and to offer a company or an individual the possibility of actually giving back directly. And what I would like to emphasize here, how is this different from like crowdfunding or from the Patreon type style of things? Well, it's actually directly into a community. It doesn't have a central player in that, because a lot of these systems fail because the central system or the central entity collapses or goes bankrupt, etc. Yeah. There are a number of technical implications on that, and we need to think about that. But I very much believe that a distributed, mutually enforced model between open source projects might be something that we want to look into to create a stable revenue stream for all. So these are our models.
We have some really nice text there, but you know, you guys, you all came into open source for various reasons. You know, it could have been because you think it's fun to program. It could be because you've identified something that's important to you and maybe has become important to other people. It could be that basically you know that what you're doing is not going to be financially viable, but you know, it really just needs to be done. Or you've thought of a way to do something better than something else someone else has done. There are all kinds of reasons, but if you want to keep sustaining, if you want to keep making yourself and other people happy, the very base of it is that we need a basic model of income associated with it if you want to sustain the building of this software.
And the basic question that we want to raise is, as an open source community, do we want the economic aspect of our work to be happening entirely separate from our actual work, or are we actually going to go business-wise? Maybe you recognize the tie from last year. Thank you.
Or are we going to do absolutely nothing? It's, you know, up to you guys. We're starting off with a couple of ideas, and we really hope that this starts a discussion which is taken up on a larger scale, because we feel it's important.
And we feel that open source developers deserve a sustainable income and a sustainable and recognizable reward for their work.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Well,
that's it for now.
Thank you for having us. I don't know, is there still time for questions? Or shall we meet up outside? Of course, it's now, I think we're 5 minutes over. So we still have some time? Any questions? Yeah, look, there. Shout it.
Correctly, yours and close, right? Yeah. So basically,
Aha.
so if you're going to charge fines, it mostly means that you need to know that somebody did something to break a rule, which GPL/open software is extremely hard, because there is no obligation to say that you're using that software. So from both of your perspectives, what you wrote there, I think it's highly realistic. And that would go well. Can I summarize the speaker? Just one more thing. There. So if basically if it was up to me, I would add the thing in the license saying that if you're using this, you need to register for a special web page or whatever. Basically that says that you're using. So if you're going to track who's using something, and if you're going to see if they're using it in a proper way, if you're going to make a regulatory agency or something like that, you already have a listing. And in the contract license or whatever, you're going to say, if you don't do that and you're using the software, you're automatically going to be fined with this by the law of businesses. That's the only way I see you're going to do something like that.
So what you basically just said, anything.
Our approach is quite ideological, as is the open source approach, and in order to break through that, you need to educate people that value-added software has a financial price. You need to pay for it. Then the second point that you raised, well, that was the third one. You say you need to edit the license and put some more enforcement in there, saying that if you download the software, you need to register, so that you already have a list of registered users and you can enforce that way. And I say, yeah, I think that's not a bad idea. You know, maybe you can edit the licenses the way you want, and I think that's something that people don't really realize. And basically, my whole idea is an edit of the license, saying if you install after a certain amount of installs or users, etc., then you need to start paying money. So you're adding to the enforceability of this.
And actually, my model is basically the registration model, but then in a distributed manner with peer-to-peer validation between open source communities that it actually happens, thereby creating also an incentive to be compliant. And the thing with people is that, we'll get back, but the thing with people and organizations is most people and most organizations don't actually want to break rules. That's not the core idea of most people. Sure, you have a large amount of companies and people who will try to find the edge cases of existing legislation and licenses, but most people in general just want to go with the flow and do what the
work
the
within
majority
the,
of the
operate
group-
within the framework of the law.
Yeah,
And what's possible.
And then you have a network effect, and that's another answer to, especially the second part of your question. If my model becomes adopted widely enough, then it will create a network effect of also excluding parties who are not compliant. And that's basically what happened in the closed source world with Microsoft, because Microsoft made most of his installed base originally by illegal copies, and then made the transition towards the paid model through the vendors. It's basically what I'm proposing, but then with open source. So I think both your questions, which are valid questions, are pretty much being handled by our model. And I want to continue the discussion with you because you've obviously thought about it, but let's do that afterwards. If there are other... Okay. Mm-hmm. The thing is that I have less control than you, and I do not enforce somebody to count the number of things they're using. If they just basically register every time they're saying, I'm using this library to build this. Yeah, exactly, but it's also dependent on somebody actually doing that. So
well, people do this at the moment. If you look at Android, it definitely has a list of the libraries in there, and you know it's quite easy to find out if you're using that. And the court case with Hancom, yeah, you know these guys they found out and they got hammered. You know, it is enforceable.
Okay,
I think registration is a part of it.
Let's cut it short because the next speaker is actually setting up.
Anyone else?
He deserves his time as well. Please, maybe if this is interesting enough for you, we can do a BOF session later. Maybe
come and join us upstairs. Have a talk to us.
Who would be interested in doing a BOF session later today to continue this approach? One, two. Three. If there's more than 5, we'll do it.
Come on. Or we could just sit out there.
We'll be out there.
Look, we've got another one.
All right.
4.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll build the list at registration desk and schedule a time for later on today.
Or tomorrow or something else. But thank you for staying in the room. I mean, it is...
I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gave you something to think about. I think that's it. Thanks. Oh, 1, 2, 3.
Thank you very much.